Big news this morning in the major banking world. Citi has named Jane Fraser as its next CEO. Fraser will be the first female to serve as the CEO of a major U.S. bank. She'll take that job in February. Michael Corbat will step down after 8 years in the role. And for more on what this means for Citi, Brian Cheung joins us now with the latest. Brian.
Well, as you mentioned, Miles, a big shakeup at the top of one of the country's largest banks, that being Citigroup. So Michael Corbat, the CEO for the last 8 years at that company, stepping aside in February of next year. At that time, Jane Fraser will step up to the role. She is the head of the company's retail banking division. She's had a long tenure and an impressive resume at Citigroup, 16 years at that New York-based bank, touching the mortgage, commercial banking space. Before that, she had stints at McKinsey and also Goldman on the way up. Again, as you mentioned, she would be the first female CEO at the head of the four largest U.S. mega banks, that being JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, Wells Fargo, and Bank of America. For what it's worth, though, this was kind of something that was expected, if not from Citi, from another one of the other banks, perhaps JP Morgan Chase, the largest bank in the United States. There was chatter some time ago about whether or not Marianne Lake or Jen Piepszak, both of which had stints as CFOs of the company, might replace Jamie Dimon at the head of that company, especially during that health scare that we saw earlier in the year with Jamie Dimon. However, there really is no succession plan at the head of that company. Who knows if Jamie Dimon will ever step aside at any point in time, which means, at least for right now, you do have Jane Fraser at the head of Citigroup, making and paving that way for women in this very male-dominated space. A fun fact for anyone that's watching, there are more people at the top 20 banks with the last name Gorman than there are women CEOs. So think of Morgan Stanley's James Gorman, in addition to a Gorman at the head of KeyCorp, although it should be noted that Beth Mooney was the first female head of a top 20 bank. But again, you have to broaden out past the biggest four to get a female CEO in the history of this very male-dominated space. Miles?
Brian, that's a fun fact, but also a depressing one, I must say. One thing that I find interesting, just thinking back to the big testimony last year with those four big bank CEOs, all white men, they were specifically asked, right, if a female successor is in the works, and none of them said yes. But then shortly after, they all started scrambling to come up with that short list. And Corbat, in this case, seems a little bit smug, right? Even with the statement, it seems like, is there this tokenization? Do we anticipate this to be an anomaly, or going forward, will this be the trajectory?
I think the question here is really going to be whether or not the pipeline for talent is there. And I would argue that it'd be hard for these CEOs at the heads of these large banks to argue that there isn't a pipeline when you consider that there are a number of female CFOs, COOs at not just the four largest banks, but at the top 20 banks at large. So when we talk about over the course of this industry, keep in mind, this is not the social media industry or some sort of emerging new technology that's only existed for 20 years. Banking in the United States, especially as a publicly traded entity, has existed since the beginning of the stock market. And it's remarkable that it's taken us this long, until 2020, to get a female head of any of these large banks. So when we talk about the likes of JP Morgan Chase, for example, we know that the pipeline is getting there because you've had a CFO, two CFOs who have been women. So again, the succession planning is there. And I think it'd be hard for any of these other large executives, not just in this industry, but in many other industries as well, to argue that it's not time to get more representation among these large S&P 500 companies.
And then, Brian, just quickly, Fraser, of course, in charge of the retail part of Citi's bank right now. What's your kind of read on what that means about the future direction of Citi? Again, this is not someone who's coming from the investment banking arm or from capital markets, but retail. That often tells you a lot, I would think, about where the board and the rest of management thinks the firm's growth trajectories are.
Absolutely. I would argue that in some respects, maybe it was a little bit of a surprise that the hire for the new CEO came from the commercial banking division as opposed to the investment banking division. This is for a company, a Citigroup, that has really dramatically downsized since the last financial crisis. You'll recall all of the woes that they had with their mortgage business in the fallout from the last financial crisis. They've been very active in trying to wind down their commercial business, actually. Their footprint is a lot smaller than it was. They divested a number of their businesses over the last 10 years, a lot of that driven by Michael Corbat, who will be stepping down here. But Jane Fraser has overseen a lot of that. And I think much to the business's success, shareholders, I would argue, have probably been pretty pleased with their ability to slim down over time when you consider that their mortgage business is much smaller now. Their credit card business is still quite strong. They rely on a lot of those partnerships with commercial retail companies and whatnot. But again, I think the story here is really going to be that, yes, while they are hiring someone who is focused a lot on retail banking, has spent a lot of time with that part of the company, it's really going to be the investment banking, especially in this low rates environment, that's going to help this large company survive and beat everyone else with the yield curve so flat. So I think that's something that's going to be in focus. But again, she's got a pretty strong team around her. Keep in mind, there's a number of other shakeups that have happened at this company before. When you consider CFO John Gerspach, a longtime steward of this company, really taking a step aside in favor of Mark Mason, who's the new CFO. So a lot of new characters here, but the focus is still largely going to be the same, which is balancing investment banking against their commercial banking teams.